Happy Monday afternoon. Dr. Alan Christensen here with you for Office Hours Live. So we're on a couple minutes early. I'm with you on Instagram and on YouTube Live and on Facebook Live. So good to connect. All right, getting settled in here. So had some good feedback in already as far as some points that people were asking about ahead of time. And let me take a peek at that. Here we go. There we go. So one question I got, kind of interesting one, was about tyrosine. And many have heard that tyrosine is part of the synthesis of thyroid hormones. So a logical question was, should I be taking tyrosine to help out? So I'll talk about that real quickly. So I'm seeing a lot of folks jumping on here with you guys on Instagram. I'm seeing some names there. I'm seeing a lot of you coming on Facebook and YouTube Live, so welcome, welcome. I'll talk just a minute about a couple points that were sent in advance. Ooh, my audio. There we go. Let me get the mic closer to me to improve my audio. There, sorry about that, you guys. Okay. A couple points were sent in advance, and I'll mention those briefly, and we'll grab a couple of your questions. So good to see you all. Marcella here, I see, is on, and many others are with us on Instagram. We got a big group on each of these, so totally cool. Welcome aboard. So yeah, one was about tyrosine, and the question was, should this person be buying it? Should I pay money to take tyrosine? So the thought was that it's part of thyroid hormones, and it could seem logical that if you add that in, your thyroid could work better. And I wanted to take a real quick, someone's with us briefly, is going to come back on in a moment. Okay, I'll be watching for you. So the question was about if it could help. And I wanted to quickly just show on this one. Okay, so here's a quick overview of how thyroid hormones are made. Lot of pictures, and this is showing up on Facebook and YouTube. No easy way to get real-time images on Instagram, but here it is in the other platforms. So basically, the thyroid pulls in iodide with a D, and that's brought inside this colloid, this nursery of cells. Within those cells, thyroid peroxidase turns iodide into iodine. When it's done with that, then it's eventually bound onto this protein called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin has these little sites made out of tyrosine. So each of these small little pentagons here is a tyrosol residue, and they're made from tyrosine. And they allow a special spot for iodine to stick to. And once it does, this molecule curls up, and we make the thyroid hormones. So that's the gist of it. And because tyrosine is an important part, a fair question could be, well, do I need more tyrosine? Maybe I'm not getting enough. Should I eat more? Should I supplement with it? Well, it seems logical, but it just wouldn't help because tyrosine, it's only about 10 or 20 amino acids out of 5,000 in thyroglobulin. The bigger factor is it's non-essential. So our bodies make tyrosine as they need it. We don't need it from our diet. We do get it from the diet, but even if we didn't, we could still make the stuff just fine. So a short version is tyrosine doesn't make a difference. So that was one. I'm seeing more coming on. Welcome you guys, Facebook, YouTube Live, Instagram, and I'm seeing a few more questions pop up. Rhonda's here as well, just saying hello, and so yeah, good to see you all. And I'm watching for the most detailed questions. When I see ones that have good detail, those are the ones I love to use to start a real conversation. And that's what I think is valuable about this. It's not so much just showing some facts that you guys could find anywhere on Google, but making it more specific and making it more practical for your own situation. So yeah, throw something up. I'll watch for that. And I'll throw something up, huh? That's kind of an odd way of putting it. Yeah, put a good question up. I will watch for that, and we'll cover a couple of those. So let me go back and cover one more that came in advance here. And this one was interesting. I would love to know what you personally eat on a typical day. and also your personal weekly workout exercise regime. Thanks, getting a lot out of your blogs and office hours. So this one comes up every so often, and I thought it's fair to share. So what do I eat? What do I do for exercise? It's evolved so much over the years. And as things stand right now, there's really no foods, no natural foods that I don't eat. I'm not sure if anyone has heard the term orthorexia. Let me know if that's familiar to you, if you've heard that before. You may have heard the terms anorexia, which is A, which is like the negation. So if A is at the beginning of a word, it basically means not that word. So anorexia is like loss of appetite, like one really is not eating much at all. So ortho is often used for right or correct. So orthorexia has been defined as almost an unhealthy sense of trying to eat correctly. And I've certainly had times in my life where I probably would have been categorized as such, where I followed like every rule there was. I was so cautious and so detailed to the point of compromising my own health, and there was points in which I was eating like one meal per day, only raw fruits and vegetables, reading all these books, hearing all these rules about why this food or that food was bad, taking all of it at face value, and really ruining my health. I've been there before. So at the same time, you can ruin your health by eating junk food or by not being diligent about how much food you're eating. So the food choices matter, and there's a real balancing act there. But one can go on either side of that. And ironically, a lot of the ways in which my health compromised as an adult probably had more to do with orthorexia than to do with just like unhealthy food. Early in life, I was just overweight. I was unhealthy and had a lot of problems with related to my seizures. I couldn't move very well. I was pretty clumsy, and so I ate just a lot of whatever, and we had a lot of baked goods that mom made, and I always had bread with meals, and I overate. I just had too much as a kid, and I wasn't at all active because I was physically limited. So I gained a lot of weight because of that. And I learned some basic ideas as an adolescent, and they served me well, and I got healthier from it. But later on as an adult, I started digging in deeper. There was more books out in nutrition, more popular health type things available, and I probably took it too far. So that was like the next chapter. And those are the health changes that caused me to end up going into medicine directly. So yeah, it's evolved a lot over the years. At some point, there's been almost any diet you can imagine I've probably tried in some severe degree. Raw food, vegan. Paleo was pretty recent. I was mostly done with all of my exploring by then, but I did briefly test that one out. But way back in the day, I did do keto back when this was from Atkins. This was like the 80s or so. So I've tried all these things and experienced with that. And what I've come to is that we're better off with simple foods. We're better off with unprocessed foods. No debates about that. But we're better off with a variety. I would argue that the healthier diets aren't the ones that are the most restrictive. I think some almost make it a badge of honor of how many things they don't eat. And it's unfortunate. I think that we miss out on a lot nutritionally. Our gut flora becomes compromised as well. There's about 16 kinds of dietary fiber. And if we cut out even just like, say, the category of grains, or we cut out the category of legumes, so those two alone, our possible diversity of fiber goes from 16 down to about like 5. So we massively restrict what our flora can get when we cut out food categories. So yes, there's no food categories that I avoid. In a given day, I probably have most all the food categories. I actually do watch the green light foods in terms of with the iodine content. So I do avoid red light foods, and I do monitor yellow light foods. I don't have thyroid disease, but I know that if I did push my iodine intake enough, I could develop it. So I do think about that, and I do avoid those things. In terms of the yellow light foods that I include regularly, I'll have a egg yolk here and there, yellow light seafood once or twice a week, non-fat Greek yogurt, I'll include that for variety. But apart from those things, it's pretty much green light, thyroid reset diet foods. Intact whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, good amounts of those animal proteins, low iodine seafood, and a pretty fair amount of that. I don't have a structure with food. I don't try to narrow my food intake in terms of like certain eating windows. I've seen the data on that, and the claims are that there's various health benefits, and it seems that the benefits correlate more so with just those that do end up lowering their food intake or eating less. I'm doing a lot of running these days. Boston's coming up in 3 weeks. I'll do my first Boston Marathon. Pretty jazzed about that. So not really restricting total food. Oh yeah, good one. I do have protein shakes. The Reset Shake is a good example of that. That is part of the mix. I do think about overall protein intake, and it's tricky because there's few foods that are dense in protein that are not also really high in carbs or fats. And so to get variety and to get to the targets, I do include those, and certainly a fan of the resistant starch as well. So yeah, that's part of the regime. And food frequency, I probably average about 5 to 7 meals in the course of a day, and pretty much all of those with some version of protein. Yeah. So, and in terms of exercise, she asked about that too. Well, right now with the race coming up, most days is running, and one day a week it's often a longer run. That could be 14 to 20 miles. A couple days a week, that's more of an interval tempo type workout. Those are often about an hour. And then another, so usually 6 runs per week. So the other days are more so moderate mixed. They could be 40 minutes to hour and a half, somewhere around there. Most days I'll do some stretching, some strength training, a little time on the foam roller. So that's pretty typical these days. When I'm not on a training schedule, it'll look a lot like that, but I'll have more bike rides and hikes in the mix, and not just runs every single day. Probably 3 to 5 runs per week when I'm not in a training schedule. So that was it. Bit of a long answer, but yeah, that's kind of how things work for me. And I saw a few other more detailed ones that came in. Other questions. Let's see. Marilyn's with us. Hey there. I'm going to look at Instagram. I saw some detailed questions there too. Here we go. Let me grab this one. Thyroglobulin antibodies and reverse T3 are always high. What's the best way to bring them down? Also, vitamin D with supplementation super low. Is there a correlation? This is My Happy Place art on Instagram. So yeah, really good question. So thyroglobulin antibodies, let's talk about that one first. So I talked earlier, let me update the image here. I talked earlier about this protein. In fact, I'll pop it back up again real quick. This protein right there, thyroglobulin. And what it is it's a place for iodine to sit. So the more iodine we have, the more that goes on the wrong places. I gotta get the image back up here. So these little loops, these little things that are circled, those white things, those are tyrosine residues. And when thyroglobulin's working right, it has somewhere around 11 to 13 iodine atoms on those tyrosine residues. But in the state of an iodine excess, we could see as many as 60 iodine atoms, and they wouldn't be in the right place because there's not room. The proper tyrosine residues don't have room for that many. So when the iodine atoms build up on the wrong places, they create free radical damage, and they cause a breakdown of the protein, and they also cause damage and loss to some of the thyroid cells. And that pulls in the immune cells, the lymphocytes. They're brought inside the tyrosine residues, and they're then treated as if they're foreign. So the lymphocytes see all this stuff going down, and they think that there's something foreign there, and the body starts to attack thyroglobulin. So that's why thyroglobulin elevates. The main reason is that it's hyperiodinated. So follow-up question, what if your iodine is low? So let's come back to that one. Now, if your iodine is low, please put a more detailed response as far as why you think it's low. I'm guessing someone tested you on that. And if you want to put the type of test you had and what your results were, we'll talk more about the iodine testing. So the question again was about how do I lower thyroglobulin? First factor is really regulate iodine and take a peek at the ideas in the thyroid reset diet for more thoughts around that. Now, reverse T3 always being high. So reverse T3, well, when it's high, it can be high for no reason. So normal healthy people can have high reverse T3. And one idea that's passed around is that reverse T3 stops your body from using T3 and it makes you feel tired and it causes these symptoms. Well, there's a partial truth there, but not totally. So if there's too much thyroid hormone, your body will make some of the extra into reverse T3. And sometimes the body does that when it's sick, when you're not functioning well. And in those cases, the reverse T3 is not an error, it's a strategy. And it's a strategy to lower the amount of thyroid hormone you're exposed to. So in those cases, you might not feel well because of being sick. And because of being sick, reverse T3 could be high. But reverse T3 is not making you sick, if that makes sense. So it's not the cause of being sick, but it can be associated. It's there because someone is sick, so that can happen. By far the most common reason for high reverse T3 is just someone being prescribed too high of a dose of thyroid medication. So yeah, hope that made sense out of that part. And the last part, vitamin D with supplementation super low. So I'll see a lot of different ideas about vitamin D, and way too low is a bad thing. No debate about that. The ideal level is probably somewhere in the mid-30s to mid-50s nanograms per mil. Now, there's different units for vitamin D for blood tests. Nanomoles per liter is the less common form in the US. So most is nanograms per mil. But that's probably the best range. If someone is supplementing and they're low, they're probably just taking too little if they're well below range. In terms of getting to target, how much we need is a function of our body size first and foremost, but then also our skin pigmentation, what latitude we live in, how far north, how much time we are outside, how much skin we have exposed outside. But many can need a few thousand IUs to get to target. But there really have been cases of people who take a normal amount and can't get to target. So it does work if you do take it. I'm seeing some follow-up questions here. Getting all of my questions answered so far from Metabolism Reset and Thyroid Reset Diet books. That's cool. Glad to hear that. Here's one about ACTH, but I saw, so the follow-up one, blood test 40, range 40 to 90. So I think you're referring to if your iodine is low. Yes. Alex Tang Ecuador? I'm not sure if I got that right. Yeah, so blood levels of iodine. So it would seem logical. I was just talking in the last breath about blood levels of vitamin D. And you can take vitamin D and you can measure your blood levels and they have a relationship for sure. Now, almost everything we know about nutrients and how they work in the body, most of those things don't apply to iodine. And blood levels are one of those. So iodine is in the thyroid, it's in the blood, it's in the urine. But there are 3 different compartments that are not all the same. Now, if you take so much iodine that you can't get any more in your urine, that's when blood levels build up. So blood levels of iodine can show when you're in a toxic range. Now, that's not even excess. Excess is long before toxic. But when there's so much your kidneys can't clear it, it becomes toxic and it becomes fatal. Iodine was a common cause of suicide in the past century. So yeah, when you're getting in that range, that's when blood levels start to elevate. And the main reason for the iodine blood test is really because of a couple of medications that have enough iodine to get you in that toxic range. And so if a doctor knows you're on that medicine and they want to make sure you're not getting toxic, they could watch your blood levels. But blood levels of iodine have no relationship between nutritional status of iodine. So yes, you could have had a blood test showing that your levels were 40. That doesn't mean you're low in iodine. That's just a misunderstanding of how that test works. So yeah, not a direct relationship that way. Okay, so I've done a bunch of questions on Instagram, and I've got several over here on Facebook and YouTube. Um, let's see. Okay, let me grab this one because this is related. So this is, can too much iodine make hair thinner? What vitamins do you recommend not to get too much iodine overload? Thanks. Yeah, so iodine, whatever it does, good or bad, comes back to thyroid hormones. Now, far too much iodine can cause your body to make the wrong amount of thyroid hormones. It can block your body from releasing thyroid hormones. And if you've got a big deficit of thyroid hormones, that can be a factor for hair thinning. Not so much like male age-related thinning, but more so diffuse and even, more commonly for women, and not really in pockets, not so much in various areas, but more even all over. Telogen effluvium is the more accurate term. And yes, abnormal thyroid levels can cause that. And way too much iodine can be a driver for that. As a generalization, the relationship between thyroid levels and hair is one that tends not to be subtle. So we don't tend to see thyroid levels cause hair loss when they're off by small amounts. It's usually the more just severe abnormalities that tend to be a factor. Iron is something to think about as being a factor that can cause hair loss even at milder levels. Abnormal cortisol levels can be as well. And thyroid hormones can. Male hormones like testosterone, DHEA, their levels in women can be a big factor. So those are some big things to think about. But sure, way too much iodine could be a factor for it. Usually thyroid is not the first thing to cause hair loss. It's usually something else, unless thyroid levels are very abnormal. So yeah, good one there. Let's see. So here's a good one here. From Kimberly, can you get too much RS in your diet? I've been doing the 2 reset shakes plus RS complete in both shakes a day, 21 days straight. Final day. Yeah, so can you get too much? Well, is it possible? There was an animal study in which it made the rounds for a while because it was a pig study, and they gave pigs this pretty unusual diet that was almost nothing but RS. And what they saw was that some types of the flora were compromised. And, not a surprise because I mentioned earlier, there's somewhere around 16 kinds of fiber. RS are one of those types. So you want a range of fibers, you want a variety. And that's what we get from a good, healthy diet. RS is one kind of fiber that there's often a real opportunity to add in more of. And doing so has been shown to better regulate blood sugar, improve butyrate, which cuts colorectal cancer risk, and also help visceral fat loss, help lose abdominal fat. RS has been shown to make a difference that way. So in theory, if you only ate it and like no other food, you may cause a narrowing of your flora. But no, adding it to a diet that includes foods from different categories, no harm to that and no real drawbacks to it. So yeah. So I'm thinking now about like follow-up questions, trying to get ones that are related to ones that have been asked already or topics we've covered already. I want to address this one real quick. My T4 is consistently low. This is one of our viewers on YouTube Live, but everything else is normal. What can I do to fix that since my doctor doesn't think it's an issue? It's been low for almost 2 years. Yeah, Shanita, good question, Shanita. If you want to take a look at Alan Christensen and Comprehensive Thyroid Labs, if you Google that, you'll see some articles I wrote on that and what your best value should be. There's been an idea that you should have high levels of T4 and high levels of T3. And where that came about was the discrepancy between normal thyroid levels and optimal thyroid function. There's this normal result in the lab range, and there's been data arguing that it's probably not good enough. Well, the difficulty is most of that data that's solid correlates with TSH. So the TSH is backward. The higher it is, the more you lack in thyroid hormone. And if it gets too low, that means you've got excess thyroid hormone. And there's quite a bit of data suggesting that healthy people, have a low normal TSH. They tend not to have a high TSH. It tends to be on the lower side. So a lot of doctors have heard about that, and they've then assumed that therefore you should also have a high T3 or a high T4. They figure that if it's good to have a low normal TSH, then the others should be on the high side. And that's totally plausible. The difficulty is that the TSH is much more sensitive. It's basically for every unit that the T4 changes, your T4 has to move 50 units for the TSH to move 1 unit. So the T4 is much less sensitive. And what that means is healthy people have a broad range of T4 levels. So the answer to your question of how do you fix it is, I wouldn't worry about fixing it. If your scores are healthy and your T4 is often low normal, well, welcome to the club. That's where healthy people generally are. They have a large range of T3, sometimes low, sometimes middle, not consistently high, however, and they often have lower normal T4 levels. So that's fine. That's not a problem. So yeah, I wouldn't assume that's something that you need to fix. Let's grab a couple more here. Is 60 milligrams armor too much for first time using medication? TSH 5.76, T3 is low. So kind of to piggyback on the last answer, I'd be curious, Patty, if T3 is like shut down, like way low, or if it's like low normal. So your TSH is high, and I don't know your T4 levels. So Patty, if your T4 was normal, we would call this subclinical hypothyroidism. Now, if your T4 was way below range, we would then call that hypothyroidism. And I state that difference, Patty, because the question is, would it help to go on medicine when you've got subclinical disease? And there's a lot of new data on this. In the past, we thought that people who had a higher TSH would feel better by going on medication. And many studies have shown that they usually don't, that they're not healthier. It doesn't lower their risk of disease. It doesn't help them lose weight. It doesn't help them improve quality of life symptoms. There was a paper out 2 weeks ago saying that there's also no benefit to cognitive function. So when I see people now that have scores like you have to where they're hypothyroid, I think more about just dietary change. And in the thyroid reset diet, I cited several studies showing that subclinical hypothyroidism responds more effectively to diet than it does to thyroid medication. And by responds, I mean scores changing and symptoms improving. So I would focus more so on dietary change and medication. Now, Patty, let's say that you had to go on meds for whatever reason. Let's say that things were further along or that was the best fit for you. It would be a pretty big step to go on to 60 milligrams of armor all at once. Now, someone might need that much, but unless they had a low level of T4, it's often a lot to add in at one point. So when their own thyroid is not shut off, it's much more common to proceed more slowly with thyroid medication. So it could be a big jump. It could cause some symptoms. But to question the question, Patty, I wouldn't even push for thyroid medication in a situation like that. So yeah, if someone's T4 is far below range, and when that happens, usually their TSH is much, much higher than yours. So you're in subclinical disease, Patty, and I've cited studies in my new book saying that roughly 80% of the time in situations like that, it can be totally reversed. So yeah, and medications, the question is, even if you're symptomatic because your thyroid is off, we would assume that correcting your levels of medications would help those symptoms, but that has not been shown to be the case. We have more and more studies piling up saying that in situations just like yours, medications don't help. They can change the scores, but they don't tend to change the symptoms. And when you have subclinical disease, there's not clear data saying that it's beneficial to manipulate those scores. So that's shocking, and that's quite different than what we'll often hear, but that's what the evidence is showing. Looking at more of the questions on Instagram, let me grab one or two more related questions, best I can find them. Pamela, what do you think of injectable vitamin D? It works. It's something that I don't find very practical because oral also works, and if you need it long term. So yeah, and the shots last only a week or so. So you could do a shot once a week long term, but you can also just take a pill. They work just fine. And most don't even need as much as they think. There's been a popular idea that we need to be on the highest side for vitamin D as well. And what happens with a lot of nutrients is that they've got a sweet spot. There's a point in which they give the most benefit. And the further you are above that sweet spot, they're just not as helpful. They just don't do what they do as effectively. So, yeah, not as much benefit that way. So, follow-up question. T4 is normal. Doctor wants me on Armour and wrote me a prescription and working on AIP diet. Yeah, Patty, there's so few studies on diet and thyroid disease, and there was one done on the AIP diet. This one was done on a group of, I think it was 32 or 34 participants, and it was an 8-week period of time. They followed the AIP diet, and they were tracked for their T4, their TSH, and their thyroid antibodies. Now, there were some benefits. The group did notice a lower level of C-reactive protein, and there were an improvement in some just quality of life symptoms. However, there were no changes in thyroid scores. So TSH, thyroid antibodies, they didn't change in the group or in the participants within the group. And I'm not saying the diet is bad. I'm just saying the one study on it showed that it didn't change thyroid levels. But Patty, so one of the studies that I cited that I based my book on, they gave it to people that had TSH scores that averaged 14. So the average TSH was 14. These are people that were further along than you are, Patty. They were actually hypothyroid. So they had a high TSH and a low T4. You're at subclinical disease, which is not as far along. And in this study, they did an iodine-regulated diet, as per the thyroid reset diet. In 3 months, 78.3% of them had totally normal thyroid function. It was totally cured. Now, that's not yet taking into account the fact that some people didn't follow the diet very well. If you look at those who did follow the diet, 97% of them saw a big improvement to thyroid function. And of them, many saw it completely normalize. Those to whom it didn't normalize, many of them had TSH scores in the 50 to 200 range. And in 3 months, they weren't normal, but they were improving. So 97% of the participants saw a really big improvement to their thyroid function on this. And again, the AIP, the one published study, no one saw significant changes to their thyroid levels. Some did feel better, and overall there was a reduction in the group C-reactive protein, so that was nice. But their thyroid function didn't improve, and they didn't have hypothyroidism at the time. They weren't as far along, even as you were. So that's why I would encourage you to put more focus on a diet that's been clinically proven to make a big difference. Let's see. Is it a good idea to add chia, flax seeds to the reset shake? Marcella, I think it's a good idea to have those foods in your diet, and they can be fine additions to the shake. You can add them into hot cereals or other things. So as I was saying before, I'm a big fan of a lot of variety of foods by category, and seeds are a great food category. I would also throw hemp seeds, sunflower seeds, other good things to throw in just for variety. So I don't really think about like a food to always have in some way, but lots of foods are great to have in the mix, and those are ones amongst those. Here's a good question with the thyroid reset diet. Tracy, is there an ideal calorie amount to have in the thyroid reset diet? Tracy, great question. And I did touch on that in the book a little bit. There have been studies showing that basically being at a healthy body weight is favorable to good thyroid function. Now, that's not to say that it's the one thing that turns it all around, but there is a two-way relationship between thyroid function and body weight. What I mean by that is if your thyroid's off, it's easier to gain weight. But it also happens the other way, meaning that if someone's gaining weight, that can make it harder for the thyroid to function well. So in terms of ideal caloric amount, I think a lot about just the value of tracking calories. And there are many people to where it's worked well for them. They have found that as an effective weight loss strategy. So I don't want to discount that to someone for whom it's worked. I have many health expert friends who think that calories are not true or not real, and they are. They're not perfect in that we can't perfectly predict how many calories someone needs. Also, food labels don't perfectly show how many calories are in the foods. There's a lot of vagrancies, but by and large, they're real. And yeah, if you go way above a calorie target, you'll gain weight. And if you eat 0 calories, you'll starve. So yeah, they're real things. Yeah, and if someone does well tracking their calories, so be it. I put a lot of thought into that in the metabolism reset diet, and I find many have an easier time following some simple guidelines than closely tracking. So I don't put an exact number in the book, Tracy, but do be aware of just a healthy body weight. And Tracy, one of the easiest ways to know that is height to waist ratio. So waist meaning belly button circumference. And the closer you get to half, the closer your belly button circumference is to half of your height, the more there's too much waste, too much unhealthy weight around the midsection. And that's a big driver of inflammation. So if someone's not at an ideal body weight, it's smart to shift back to that. And one way to do that is to eat at a calorie deficit. I think it's more effective to do it in a way to where it's a short-term project and you're doing things differently. I don't think the idea of living in a weight loss mode is healthy or sustainable for people. But yeah, for more of my thoughts on that, look at the metabolism reset diet. Okay, let me grab 1 or 2 more. This is one I just saw before that was kind of curious. I don't see it very commonly. Someone was asking about her ACTH. It was high, but thyroid markers were normal. So blissful Beck's ACTH is high. Now ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's a pituitary hormone telling the adrenals to work and mostly to make cortisol. That hormone does fluctuate as cortisol levels fluctuate. So if that was done at a time when cortisol levels were lower, that can be, So you're saying yours was high, okay? So if that's happening earlier in the day when cortisol levels are higher, that can fit to a point. If it's far too high and it doesn't make sense with the cortisol, we think of a couple things. One of which is that there can be an adenoma making ACTH, and that can come from the pituitary, it can come from elsewhere. That's rather rare. Also, we think about just the relationship between those two hormones. They should be on a dipole. So if we're seeing that ACTH is up and the body's making cortisol, that's normal, that's expected. So think more about the context of it relative to cortisol rather than it by itself. It's a lot like the TSH of the thyroid. It's like the TSH of the adrenals, so to speak. I can speak for many of us here. Thyroid patients are grateful for information. Thank you for that. Appreciate the feedback. All right, let me grab one more. Oh, here's a good one. Yeah, this is important. I've talked a lot in various contexts about how critical it is to get a nice balance of good quality protein and how that's important for body composition. When you say a protein powder is incomplete, you mean it doesn't have all the essential amino acids, correct? Is this negative to eat, or can one just add the 9 essential amino acids to make up for that? Well, so good question. So this generally comes up, Kathy, in the context of collagen. So collagen bone broth proteins. So they're incomplete, and they don't, I was going to say they don't take away from your body's protein, but in some contexts they actually do. So if you're lower in overall protein and a high percent of your protein comes from incomplete sources, it's almost like you're less off than you would have been otherwise. You almost end up being more behind than you would otherwise. If you've got an abundant amount of protein, you can coast and have a little bit of it be from incomplete sources and do okay. But if you're not abundant, and if you're barely getting by for your lean body mass, incomplete proteins can be counterproductive. So that's the concern that way. And my biggest concern, I'm not really concerned about bone broth in the kitchen, like as a culinary ingredient, but bone broth or collagen as a protein supplement, it's misleading because even though there's a certain number of grams of protein there, they don't affect you in the useful way that dietary protein does because they're very incomplete. There's some amino acids that we can make when we need them and others we cannot. And the ones that are in bone broth and collagen are just the ones that we don't really need. So yeah, not helpful as a protein supplement. And I've had so many times, it's made me sad, of people who have done the metabolism reset diet and they've worked really hard to do it well and it wasn't effective for them. And afterwards, they reached out to me. One was a personal friend, and he said, I did the diet you told me to, and I wanted to drop some pounds, and I got to tell you, it just didn't work. I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how you did it. And so we went through, and I troubleshooted it with him. And it turned out his protein supplement was a collagen supplement. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Some are called collagen, some are called bone broth, and some are called hydro beef. And that one is confusing. I used to think that hydro beef supplements were like just meat. They were just like meat protein, but they're not. They're collagen. Now, collagen is a really popular product to sell because it's the cheapest protein there is. It's hooves and hides and like spare parts that are basically garbage otherwise. So it's a very low cost raw material, but it doesn't work. And so when someone relies on that, they're just like they're not getting protein. They lose muscle mass and they don't get the benefits to their metabolism. So that's why I try to point that out because too many people have tried to use those and ended up not getting success where they probably would have otherwise. Here's a quick one I can address easily. Oh yeah, so just to follow up on that, Kathy, even hydro beef is not complete. No, it's not. And that makes me nuts. I used to think that it was an actual protein, but what happened was I got a raw material supplier to give me the amino acid breakdown on hydro beef. And I compared it to the amino acid breakdown of collagen. It's the exact same thing. So yeah, it's not meat. It's not muscle tissue. It's just collagen. It's connective tissue. So Kathy, what spare parts? Ick. Yeah, it's hide and it's connective tissues and it's hooves and it's not the stuff that we would actually eat because it's not quality. It's not sustainable. And one last one, probably the last one I'm going to get here. I'm doing the thyroid reset diet, but having a hard time finding dairy alternatives without sea salt. Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that one, Rochelle. So this is actually not a concern. Now, sea salt can have high iodine, and I did talk about that, and that's why you'd be concerned about it, rightfully so. The distinction, though, is that you've got to have a lot of sea salt for that to matter, and this is helpful because a lot of foods have sea salt, and there's not much. So they wouldn't really have enough to where their iodine content could be appreciable. And the cutoff there is 500 milligrams of sodium. So when you're looking at something like, say, an oat milk, take a look at the sodium per serving, and it's not going to be 500. If it's below 500, the amount of sea salt in there will not be enough to give you a relevant amount of iodine. So once you're seeing that you're below 500 milligrams of sodium per serving, you can ignore the fact that it's got sea salt as an ingredient. So that'll open up a whole lot of the plant-based dairy options. And there's more and more of those on the market nowadays. So yeah, really, really cool option. Kim is with us on day one. Welcome, Kim. But yeah, I just want you guys to hear that. So non-dairy, plant-based dairy products that have sea salt, just look at the sodium content. It's almost always way below 500 milligrams per serving. If it is, you can ignore it if they use sea salt. So you can still use that as an option, even if they use sea salt. So yeah, hope that was helpful. Okay, good to see you guys this afternoon. Office Hours Live. Lots of really good questions. Let me turn the chat off here. There we go. Lots of good questions. And look forward to seeing you guys next week. Same time, same place. I will be, okay, so we've got next week and the following, and then I'm going to be away for 1 or 2 weeks. One of those will be Boston. I'm excited to go run in Boston 3 weeks from today. That'll be cool. And then after then, I think I'm going to be traveling for helping my parents with a surgery. So yeah. All right, but take good care, you guys, and I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.